Welcome for the Te Pūtiyaki Mana Taonga webinar this afternoon. It's the 6th one in our series, and it's about developing a virtual gallery tour, 360-degree view of an exhibition with education elements in it as well. So we've got Lisa, Rebecca and Nick joining us today to present. So I'll introduce them in a moment after we have our opening karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, hei tio, hei huka, hei hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. So welcome. We're really excited to have some wonderful presenters today. Before I introduce them, I just want to make a note that, as with all the other webinars we've been doing, we will be recording this webinar and posting it on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook for those who can't make it to the live event to watch, and we always blur out participants' faces. So welcome. We have 3 presenters today who are going to share the discussion and tell us all about how they developed this 360-degree tour of the Brett Graham exhibition that was recently at the Govett-Brewster Art Gallery. So we have Lisa Burnt, who is the Curator of Public Engagement at the Govett-Brewster, and sitting in the room with her is Rebecca Faulkner, who is an educator at Govett-Brewster. Oh, I'm sorry, it says Puke Ariki on our slide. That's wrong, that's incorrect. She's at Govett-Brewster. And I've known Rebecca for many, many years. In fact, we met at a MEANS conference, and MEANS was the predecessor to Te Pūtiyaki Mana Taonga many, many years ago. So we've been friends and colleagues for quite some time. And when I worked at City Gallery, we would often receive touring exhibitions from Govett-Brewster. And sometimes I'd have the opportunity to go to Govett-Brewster and see the exhibition that was coming to us at City Gallery. And Brett Graham's exhibition was one of those. So I was really, really privileged to be able to see the exhibition in situ that we're going to be talking about today. And Nick and I have never met in person, but we've had some great conversations online. So Nick Seti Ducato is Digital Systems and Product Specialist at Puke Ariki, which is just across the road and round the corner from Govett-Brewster in New Plymouth. And the 3 of these wonderful people worked really closely together as a team to develop the 360-degree tour that they're going to be talking about today. And we've sent everybody who registered for this webinar the link to view that tour in advance of this webinar, so you could know what they're talking about. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Lisa, Rebecca and Nick.
Kia ora koutou. Okay, that's the first hurdle bounded over. We're a little bit nervous here about all this technology, but thank you very much for having us, and it's lovely to be speaking to our colleagues around the country and sharing what we did. So I'm an educator, as you heard, and we were really, really excited and looking forward to the exhibition Tai Moana Tai Tangata. So we can't really show you clips of it easily in this format, so we just have to presume that you've had a chance to look at it, or you will be able to afterwards. So we were so excited when we heard this exhibition was coming our way. It was a long time in development and it had been delayed quite a few times. So we felt like the opportunities for using it had been reduced as to what we expected, because it was also going to be showing over the December break. So we started thinking about the options of preserving it and creating a virtual tour. In this slide we have the pohiri, the iwi from Tainui and Taranaki arriving in the gallery. For me and a lot of my colleagues, this was a real highlight. I've been at the gallery for 19 years and this was my absolute highlight. It was spine tingling to hear the karakia, and to see everybody connecting with Brett's beautiful sculptures. So Tai Moana Tai Tangata, as you might just be able to pick up, is exceedingly rich exhibition, really for our local area, and for the stories that come with it is something that we didn't think that would be replicated easily. It was unprecedented. So we thought now's the time to branch into the virtual world, to preserve it and to extend its use. We were looking forward in the future to the Aotearoa Histories curriculum development as well. And as a contemporary art gallery, we don't always have exhibitions that will fit that easily with that curriculum area. So for us, we also wanted to hold on to it. So next slide, here's me with one of the films, Te Namu, which we had plenty of classes. Probably main age group were intermediate. So there were other things happening that helped us decide that we really did need to try something new and make a virtual tour. The possibility of COVID threatening, they had meant that we knew that the exhibition could be curtailed as it was in Wellington. And we felt like it would be a little bit of a leap of faith, but we'd give it a go. So the first step in our virtual tour journey was really taken by Lisa. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. Yes, and the first step is so often is kind of really just a very informal chat to Nick, who had started at Puke Ariki not too long before. He had done the first virtual tour for Puke Ariki, and we just started talking about what that experience was like. And as you will hear, Nick is very generous in sharing his skills and knowledge. He offered, you know, we could give it a go. We could try to produce your first virtual tour. And as Rebecca just outlined, there were just so many good reasons to give it a go, and to really preserve and prolong this amazing, unique exhibition with such relevant content for us. Yeah, and the exhibition itself, as you maybe seen in the photos before, really felt like a taonga itself. And as much as possible, we really wanted to preserve the Māori perspective on the show. So the nature of the exhibition really meant that this was a real team effort. It wasn't one person, it was really a wide range of people. I mean, you see 3 of us here today, and we also had Lucy, who can't be here today, who's working on our digital engagement. And then I just thought on the slide that you see here, where you can see all the different menu points, it's actually quite good to illustrate who else was part of this. So if you've seen the tour, when you first enter, you actually hear karakia. So that was a collaboration with our kaumātua, Parikawano, who came in and we recorded the karakia for us to be part of this show, to really welcome you into the space. Obviously, naturally, the first collaborators are the artists, Brett Graham, and also the curator, Anna-Marie White, who we worked closely with, though they also gave us a lot of trust to kind of produce the tour, but we regularly checked in with them. We had a translator who not only translated but actually created the wall labels in the exhibition itself, and Te Reo, who then also did the audio for us here in this tour, and then also actually did the audio in English as well. And yeah, as I said, we had never done this before, so it was really the first for us, and Nick was really vital in this process. And like Rebecca said, I mean, COVID was already around, lots of virtual tours popping up. So I was also thinking, you know, how can we contribute sort of some real value and meaning rather than just producing another tour, to think about the layers that we can offer our audiences, rather than doing a quick sort of, let's say, Google Street View. And one of the first things that Nick said to us was really kind of think about your target audience. And I think that's the first thing we really decided on, to focus on an education audience, But yes, now I'll just hand over to Nick to look into the huge part that he played in this collaboration.
Kia ora. I'm Nick. As Lisa and Rebecca have mentioned, I'm the digital specialist at Puke Ariki Museum. And so my role there, I've been with the museum for about 2.5 years, and we actually started collaborating on this project probably about 9 months into my my role at Puke Ariki. So my background and interest in virtual tours is actually kind of on the photography side of things. So in a previous life, I worked in the film industry, and I was just interested in capturing spaces and figuring out the technique for the photography and actually building these 360 images of environments. It's something that they use in film quite a bit, and actually early on started with actual film photography, printing out panoramas and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I was coming from in my interest in this tool. And so when I started at the museum, we started having conversations. I was talking to colleagues, trying to figure out, just learn about the museum and past shows. And so often we'd be talking to someone who would mention a previous exhibition, and I would say, oh, are there any images of that? And there would be a few photos from, say, the opening or maybe some of the concept design. But I realized that this tool, this 360 photography, might be a really great way to capture an exhibition in context. I think that's kind of what you miss from just a bunch of still images. You lose that context of the space. So I just happened to start at the museum when we had a really epic 100 years exhibition on. So it was a really great opportunity to go down into the galleries every day before the museum opened and start photographing. And so that was kind of how at Puke Ariki we started exploring virtual tours. And so we've got a few of them that we've done now that are on the website. But this was the still that you see here is a screen grab from that first virtual tour of Whare Kahurangi. And so that was kind of just, let's explore archiving exhibitions. That's where I was coming from. And actually building the tour, this first tour was a bit of a first for me as well. And so this tour was, I think, a demonstration of the tool. We kind of threw a little bit of everything into it. So there's a lot in the show. It was a pretty big show. But when I started speaking with Lisa about her idea for the Brett Graham virtual tour, that's what we focused on. Let's start with the intention, because I think around that time you were starting to see a lot of virtual tours from other museums, and there was a lot of interest because of lockdowns and COVID. But what we also saw was that the interest kind of peaked and the novelty wore off. So people would check out a tour, and it was really cool that you could visit the British Museum, or you could pop into the Smithsonian. But then I think people had seen things like Google Street View, and if there wasn't anything more to it, they kind of lost interest. So that's where we kind of started in our conversation. What's the intention behind doing the tour? And of course, with this show, as Lisa mentioned, it was just a really great opportunity to capture this really once in a lifetime show. And it's the sculptures and also the sound in the space were something that we wanted to capture. So we started talking about the considerations around that. I think intention and audience were at the forefront, and then that kind of drove everything else. But there are a few things that we talked about as well. This is kind of new. I think it's still kind of new, and we're figuring out how do we account for visitation? How do we actually count visits to a virtual tour? Is putting a virtual tour up going to discourage people from visiting the museum, visiting the gallery? But I think what we found is that it actually has the opposite effect. I think it's a great tool for a lot of reasons. You might have people who want to know if they're for sensory reasons or for wayfinding, so they can check out the show before they actually come to the space. And the analogy we like to toss around is that idea of like your favorite band might put all their music up on Spotify, but you still go to see them in concert and you'll still buy the t-shirt. So if anything, it's actually, I think, aiding and increasing interest in coming to exhibitions and that sort of thing. But beyond all that, then we started talking about the technical demands and how do we do this. So with my experience with this first tour, we that's kind of where we started the conversation. Okay, what can we do with this idea? And I think the intention to make it a tool for educators was what really drove everything else. And yeah, so I guess Rebecca can talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Nick. So our vision for the tour was really to attempt to replicate what a class would experience when they actually came into the gallery. We were new to this, so that seemed the obvious thing to do. We haven't had a chance to properly test it with the class yet. So I guess one of the good things about the digital world is we can go back and change it if we need to, and adapt it, add and take away. But keeping that format in mind did mean that there were quite a few decisions that we had to make, some about what content we would include and some also about how people would access that content. So looking at the slide at the moment, a person visiting the virtual tour is quite lucky. They don't get to see it in real life, but they do get to have quite an insight into material that wasn't available either at the time when you were visiting. So when a school group came, like I suppose all the rest of your classes, they do get a lot of extra information, and they get the benefit also of talking with each other and hearing other people's opinions, and the educator will try and draw out people's comments, and it'll end up a great discussion that you may not necessarily get when you're just visiting on your own or just with one other person. So we tried to replicate that as much as possible. One of the really unique things about this exhibition for us was how it used Te Reo Māori and English together. So the wall labels, as Lisa mentioned, were written in English by Anna Marie White, but the Te Reo was written by Te Ingonaia, and we wanted to preserve both of those. We would like to be able to have this whole tour in Te Reo Māori. That was like out of our timing really when we put it out, but we've reserved all the Te Reo as it is. So if you're looking at the section there, that's what any visitor read when they came in. It's quite complex language, so when we do another tour, we revisit it, we'll attempt to do what we also did with the general wall label, so from Cease Tauranga doing on there, is to rewrite it for young readers, because some of it was beautiful poetic language, but young readers would struggle with knowing what the meanings of some of the references were. So that turned out to be quite a mission, and as a lot of the material is quite sensitive, it was quite difficult to make sure that we didn't lose the feeling of the exhibition and the tone of the wall labels in the process of trying to explain it or over-explain it. So you could, in the tour, the first thing you might do is you might look around and then you would click on and you could read those together, or you could listen to them. That was one decision we took. We talked to people on our team and got opinions about how they like to get information, decided that we'd have them all audio as well. So the Te Reo and the English, there you can choose which one you want. It's a bit special for us though, because the Te Reo is all spoken beautifully in Taranaki dialect by Te Ingo, which is different to for people around the country to hear how that sounds. So we think that's special as well. So the next slide. We also decided that we needed to include what we had used with classes as in background material, and in the actual tool you can click on these to enlarge them. This proved to be a bit of a headache in size in the end for files. It's definitely worth doing, but it meant that we had to compromise on some other things because each file ended up to be huge really. And the next thing, we popped in there focus questions, because we anticipated, or we imagined that a whole class or a group could sit down looking at a bigger screen, like you might have in a classroom, and actually look at this together rather than a person reading it or looking at on their phone individually. So that's why we have focus questions there, and that's probably the key point, which makes it more of an educational tour rather than a general tour. That said, we've had plenty of people who are adults or people who aren't school-minded and experiencing the tour and really finding that the questions and the extra information is quite valuable. So what were the technical steps in the tour? Back to you, Nick.
Right, so this slide that you see is just a beautiful color coordinated workflow. So this is more of a wish than a, I think with this project, it like anything, it's a creative project. And so this was just a kind of workflow to help guide us, because there were so many collaborations, and we're essentially building a website. And we have all different research and assets and the build and the photography and all these elements that need to come together. So this was just to kind of help guide us. But I think like with any creative project, you end up just kind of pulling it, kicking and screaming into reality through like sheer force of will. So, but I think with what this is showing, you could kind of break down into, for a virtual tour like the one we've created, you could break that down into 3 stages. So you've got the first stage is what I call that capture stage, and that's the photography of the space. So the 360 images that allow you to kind of look around and have that sense of space. It's a real particular type of photography where you're taking images of a room, lots of different images, and then stitching them together. And it's actually the web browser that allows you to spin around and look as if you're standing in that place. But the image we produce is still just photography. And so there's different ways to approach that capture phase. And there's, I'll explain a little bit later, but there's kind of what I call the low-res version and the high-res version. And for this, we went with the high-res version because we have the skills, we have the camera, the equipment, and also it's just to capture the exhibition with that level of detail was really important to what we were trying to do. So that's that first stage, the capture stage. The second stage is kind of the author stage, or the build stage. And that's where we're putting it all together. And that was probably the bulk of the work, because that's where all the decisions were made. How do we include audio? What are the pop-ups going to look like? What's the content? Putting that all into authoring that experience. So that's stage 2. In stage 3 is then you have this thing and you need to publish it and share it. So it doesn't just put itself online. And so it's a whole separate stage. And I think each of those stages have their own technical challenges and opportunities. And I think one of the things I wanted to emphasize today too is that we went about this, what I call that high-res version, but there are other ways to approach making a virtual tour. And I think if you go back to what Lisa spoke about, that intention and the audience, that really is so important, because I think you could do a low-res version of something that maybe it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it could still have that value and meaning. And so that's why we spent a lot of time talking about that up front before we even got into that middle stage of building it all. Yeah, so I think after publishing the tour, we were in a position where we had all those stages kind of sorted. We were able to look at, okay, we can do this. We have the gear, we have the software, and we can publish the tour. And then the next challenge really was, there was a lot of context and content that maybe wasn't appropriate to put into the virtual tour. So we had an opportunity to put that on the website, which Lisa will talk about. Oh, but actually there's a few more slides. And this is, if you want to, yeah, so this just real quickly, talk about that process. This is what we started with. So this is just a sketch. So we're trying to imagine, what is this going to look like when it's finished and on the website? And I think, and that sketch then becomes a wireframe, sort of a cleaner mock-up version. And then the next slide, you'll see that's what it translates to in the end. So just wanted to show you through that process that you can literally start the concept. You might not have all of those tools to build the final product, but if you start with an idea and you understand the process, you may be able to find someone who can help you with that authoring stage, who can help you with that publishing stage. But there's nothing to stop you from coming up with the idea, the concept, and drawing it on a napkin, and then translating that to the next step. So this is kind of a thing, a real film thing too, starting with the storyboard and working it out before you get on set. And that's kind of how we approached it. So then when we had this tour finished, it needed a place to live. And so I'll just pass it back over to Lisa to talk about the decisions around putting that on the website.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. So yeah, I mean, Nick, we've talked about, okay, now we have our tour and what do we do with it? And I mean, Nick will talk about this a bit more later on as well. I mean, one of the things is in terms of where does it actually live, on what platform, and then how do we integrate it into our website. So we established that it's going to live, you know, on an external platform, and then basically kind of like a YouTube link, we could include it into our website. But first we had to decide, well, where on the website will it actually live? And we did kind of do quite a bit of research looking at other museums' websites and where they hosted their tours. Sometimes it was actually really hard to find them, and you had to dig quite deep into the menu of the website. So when we looked at our website, which is far from ideal in terms of how it's set up, but we still wanted it to be found relatively quickly. So under our, what you can see on the left side, what's on, we have our exhibitions and events and cinema, and we just kind of decided to put it on the same level as that. And then we also had to decide, okay, well, once we know where that is, what does the subpage look like? And I don't know how many of you would work in terms of your website. We have an external contractor who would then create a subpage, so we had to be very clear what we wanted on there. And as was mentioned, I mean, we had quite a lot of content and a lot could go into the tour, but not everything could go into the tour. As you would have seen, I mean, there were quite a few sculptures, and then we had 3 films which already had, you know, quite a high volume. So we still wanted an introduction to the actual exhibition. We wanted to briefly have a biography of the artist and also of the curator. We wanted to show some of those images that you've seen today of the exhibition itself, having people in the space to get a sense of, you know, what do you call it? A sense of scale. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. And also on the website to have the possibility to download further materials such as Google Slides, etc. So that's what we kind of had to think about. So a few of the things I've already mentioned, the bios, but then also we had further audio material. We had an introduction again by Tai Moana, which we then put on our website. So those were sort of the decisions that we had to make when we realized, well, not everything could live in the tour. So the website became a really good alternative. I mean, a few things that of course then come up in terms of that you have to think about is the intellectual property side and the images that you're using. And I guess for an educational purpose, that makes things a bit easier. And also we were working here with one artist. So of course, if you're, for example, thinking of a group show, or we're working on a future virtual tour where we're thinking, well, some material that's in the exhibition can be included, but others can't, and how do we deal with that? So those are sort of a few questions that came up for us. But we were really happy how things went. I mean, so far we know we've had about 1,500 visits to the virtual tour, and they kind of stayed in the tour for about 4.5 minutes, which is a really long time to spend actually in the virtual space. So we obviously must have done something right. But we know that the way we went about it is not for everyone. So Nick wanted to continue talking about what different options you have when you go about creating your own tour.
Yeah, so this is probably not the best illustration of the idea, but I spoke about that low-res, high-res approach. And so if you think of the virtual tour in those 3 stages, so you have the photography, you have the build, and then the publishing, you could almost approach a project like this with a mix of low-res and high-res for each of those stages. But for the photography, if you start with that, it does require quite a bit of specialist gear and software to capture the space in the detail that we did. But there are also off-the-shelf cameras, so that's the kind of low-res, quick version, off-the-shelf 360 cameras. And there's even some apps for smartphones where you can capture a space. Of course, the quality is going to be different, but you may have seen these sorts of 360 images on Facebook. You can even post them up on Facebook. So that capture stage you can do in a number of ways. But to go for that high quality version, that's what we did. We have a special panorama tripod head, and it's just a digital DSLR camera that's calibrated for that head, and then there's some specialist software. But for each of those stages, there's probably an option for the low res version. So even for the build, so I just wanted to present in the next slide, there's just a few quick examples, and there are heaps of things out there, but also it's kind of just thinking about it a bit differently. We can build a virtual tour, we can photograph an exhibition, but if you don't have that opportunity or you don't have those resources, you can use some of the tools that are already out there. Google's actually one of the best examples of that. There's Google Street View is essentially the same photography, the same approach that we're talking about with this virtual tour. They drive a car around with a special camera on the roof and capture a series of photos, just like we did in the gallery. So you could use something like Google Street View to actually build a resource. So it wouldn't be the same thing as a virtual tour with the content embedded in it, but it's just kind of a different approach that I wouldn't rule out. But if you did want to approach the kind of high-res version that we did, there are the tools that we use. So we used a software called Pano 2VR, but there are a whole bunch of tools out there and websites. They all have really ridiculous names. I think there's like a rule in Silicon Valley that your tool has to have a silly name like Clapty or Boopy, and it's just so funny. But there are a few of them like that, where you can essentially, if you can capture the photography, there's cloud-based solutions. So you may not be able to do it yourself, or if you can hire someone to capture the photography, and then you upload the images and build the tour through a website, and it's all self-contained. So those are some of those cloud-based options are like a website called Clapty and RoundMe. I told you they're all really ridiculous names. There's also, if you wanted to hire someone, this Google Street View is another really good example. If you don't have the photography skills or the hardware, for example, there are people who are doing the photography for Street View. So if you've ever Googled, say, a business or a cafe or somewhere you're going and you see these 360 images on their Google page, someone's gone in and actually photographed that for them. So that could be another option for approaching the photography in a show or using what's already out there. There's also another tool. There's an app called Google Arts and Culture, which I quite like. There's a lot of really interesting tech. They're kind of on the cutting edge with a lot of the tech that's being used in the glam industry. So they'll present virtual tours, augmented reality, and there's just some really beautiful images and pages from museums all over the world. But one of the tools that they've added recently is called Expeditions, and it's essentially what I was talking about with taking something like Google Street View. So you've got this just this huge resource of images, and they're creating little narratives in Google Expeditions using those images. So that might be another option. So you're actually kind of skipping that whole publish phase. It's already been published. So I think you could go the route that we did with the capture, high-res capture with the DSLR camera, the specialist software Pano 2VR, and then in our case we were able to publish to. We had a platform to publish to, and then of course share that on the Govett-Brewster website. But you could look at something like Cloud Pano or Clapty or RoundMe, and there are heaps more out there. I think one thing I would say though is just do your research, and there's a lot of products, and RoundMe is a good example. I have some panoramas that I've taken just for fun to show my family back home, New Plymouth, for example, and I posted them on RoundMe, and the website will go down, but then it'll be up the next day. But it's kind of, you just need to be aware of the technical risks of, say, buying a subscription to something. Just look into it. But that's why I think things like Google are actually really useful, because it's a big company, but they're not going anywhere. So something like Google Arts and Culture is probably going to be around, and they're going to continue to support it. But yeah, I think going back to whatever approach you take or decide to take, is the important thing is that intention and starting with the concept. And it could be really simple. And in this case, we had a great show to work with, but I think just adding something a bit more than the 360 images is what really makes these a useful tool. And that's what we've seen, especially since the pandemic started. There was a real interest in just visiting a space, and that was enough. But I don't think that's so kind of worth the time and energy. I think if you're going to build something, you want it to be kind of meaningful. So just start with that. And I'll pass it back to Lisa and Rebecca.
Thank you. That's so good. All that great information. Thanks, Nick. I like to call him the fairy godfather of the project. So in a moment, we'll go to questions, and we hope we've got some, but we had plenty of unanswered questions ourselves. And a real big one that we are still pondering, that you might be able to give us your experiences on, is to do with how we make the connection between, well, it was LEOTC, but ELC, counting of numbers and knowing the impact, and how we can interact with the schools or groups who use the tour. So at this point, our intention is to also load up the hands-on lessons that we participated with students and make some new ones as Google Slides, and then not load them onto our website, but have them available by request, because it's important to us to be able to know what happens next with this content. It's nice for it to go out into the world as well, and plenty of people now have access to it who didn't before, but then it's important to us to know who's using it, how they're using it, and whether we can follow up with them in the future or in different ways. So that's a real big question for us, which some other organisations who are already using literature tours might already have some answers to. So, brilliant. Yes. And back to you in the studio, Helen.
I love that live cross, as if you're, a TV presenter. You've really got this, Rebecca. Thank you, guys. That was really, really interesting. It was great to have that insight and seeing the journey of how it developed and all of the things you had to consider to go into it. It's such a huge piece of work, but what you've produced is just so amazing. It really is a taonga in itself. I think that. So well done. And we've got some questions that have started to come in the chat. So I'll just scroll up to the first one that I noticed, which was from Laura Jones. Do you know how schools have made use of this? And there was another one further down from Brianna, which was also about, did you engage with schools with this virtual tour? Was it more sharing the resource to schools and allowing them to explore it on their own? Or were you also joining them online to help break down that complex language? So two slightly different questions, but about how schools are engaging with it or could.
Really, we have, apart from just a couple of people, we have no idea yet, because that's going to be our task for early next year. So I think that first step is we'll send it out and then tag along into a classroom, because the only experience we have really using digital communications and things with schools is when we've taken Google Slides into schools. So we need to see how it works before we kind of go any further. We've sent it out to some schools who did visit the exhibition for them to follow up with and to see what they thought about it, etc. But it was quite a big undertaking for us to get that right. So we're hoping, if you ask us in 6 months or so, we'll be able to get back to that and see how it's going. As I said before, we're able to put a new version up as well if we find that it's not working that well. There's plenty of things in it that could be tweaked. So we're looking forward to doing that ourselves, and also to hearing how other people could envisage it could be used. So by all means, if you have any ideas on that one, how you think it could be used, or how would it be, we'd like to hear them. Yeah.
So I just want to check that I've understood you correctly. So next year you plan to offer it as a virtual / outreach program to schools?
Well, I mean, it's always just there online, and plenty of people do just come across it and will use it. Actually, I say the only thing we've done is Google Slides. That's not true. We have also put little activities up, then live-based activities through Instagram, and it's been a real surprise how widely those were taken up around the country, and they also live there. So 6 months, 12 months later, we're still getting people going, oh, we made that. It was really cool. We did that. So these things can have quite big lives. But as far as actually pinning down how it's used and doing case studies, that will be our job for really next year, especially at the moment where we're not getting that many visitors in the gallery, and we might not for a while. Because this is so locally based, it's going to be a real in for us. The other nice thing about it is for South Taranaki schools, there are some wonderful content in that tour that really relates to the area. So we'll be able to travel through to them and take our art gear with us. So we'll just use it as our kind of inspiration and then, build from there.
Nice. That sounds really cool. And I think, that's hitting so many things. It's hitting a lot of the new ELC fund about local curriculum, outreach, using digital in a meaningful way, incorporating te reo. You're hitting so many of those things that have become new priorities in that fund. But also, if COVID really does hit us next year or quite soon, then you've got this amazing resource that you can actually use for outreach, and it ties in with the histories curriculum. So you've really hit so many different areas with that one resource. Nick, you've raised a hand. What would you like to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to, that kind of reminded me, I didn't emphasize that when we talked about those 3 stages. One of the reasons we focused on that high res capture was because I think that's probably the priority, is the photography stage, because we can reuse that. And that was the priority before the show was gone. Obviously, once it's gone, we can't photograph it. So that was phase 1, was make sure we get really good captures of this beautiful exhibition. And as Rebecca mentioned, there's opportunities to then reuse that in different ways. I think that's kind of becomes like the canvas for other resources. So if you were going to look at investing time and energy into that stage of a virtual tour, is probably the most important right up front, getting really good photography.
And maybe can I just add to that in terms of photography, I guess doing it the second time around, you have, of course, a better idea of what to look out for, because you remember, Nick, you asked us sort of from how many points in the exhibition do you want, the photography to happen. So where can you actually, turn around, look up, etc. And I think in the beginning it was really hard to imagine what that actually meant. Whereas now, of course, with the second one, to really imagine yourself in the space. If you turn around, what do you want to look at? What do you want to maybe zoom in? Or, you get a better idea of what it actually means to move in a virtual space. It's good to think about that quite thoroughly, right, Nick? So, because you can't go back and photograph it later on if the exhibition's gone.
Awesome. Well, we've got another question from Jackie. How much time all up would you recommend setting aside to develop a tour like this with all the phases?
I would say we've been able to, at Puke Ariki, we've just done a few tours recently that took about a month and a half, but that's with the photography already being done. And that beautiful color coordinated chart we showed earlier kind of is a 3-month workflow. So I think that's realistic, but I think each situation is going to be different in terms of resources. But yeah, I think putting a lot of time into that concept stage is really going to drive everything else. And those storyboards, those drawings, and as Lisa said, now that she's seen this and in the space, we can imagine what kind of photography would work for the next show. You have a better idea of it. But I think a lot of the work up front is that conceptual work, and it'll save you making decisions down the track. But 3 months is probably doable. A year is probably better, but we don't all have that. So I mean, yeah, I think it can be done quite quickly, but you don't want to rush it.
And I can see, Nick, that you've put a couple of examples of different off-the-shelf camera options and low-res cameras, and some of the sites that people can use to build 360 tours, which is great. But I'm really keen to know, like the high res, how expensive is that? Like, you know, what sort of ballpark figure are we talking about? I know you probably can't tell us your exact budget, but you might be able to give us a ballpark so that we've got an idea of, for some other museums who might be thinking about investing in this and doing this,
Sure.
whether they could actually afford to do it or not.
The cost is really in the camera, which we already have for our digitization program. The real trick is the panorama tripod head, which is a specialist piece of gear. The cost is about, for those heads, that you could get them for about $1,000, under $1,000. But right now, the difficulty with something like that is sourcing supply. It might not be in the country, and it might not be available for a while. But if you already have a DSLR that you're using for your digitization program, that's half the battle, a good lens. But you can also do the high-res version with kind of lower enthusiast kind of level digital cameras. But I'd say all up, you're looking at a few $1,000s for the hardware. The software is not that expensive. I think the software we use is probably a few $100s or euros, I think it's actually. But the cost in the software is actually just the time and learning it, like any piece of software for the development. But if you've got a camera and you've got a good lens, it's getting that tripod head. Because that's the real trick with the specialty photography, is the way that it rotates.
Wow, that's really good to know. Thank you. Nathan's, yeah, I agree with you, Nathan. He says Nick's really expensive. You can't steal him. Are you the most expensive part of this project, Nick? Oh, you're so lucky at Govett-Brewster to be able to be sharing Nick as a resource in terms of skill. So yeah, that's really fantastic. It'd be interesting to know how many other people around the country have these kinds of skills or knowledge sets or prior experiences. We've got another question from Laura. It'd be interesting to know the audience for this, if it's just educators. Do you have any evidence that it's reaching a wider audience?
I think most of our views would be the wider audience, because we haven't really even got into our swing, because we haven't finished doing our Google slide kind of practical activities yet. We haven't gone full on with our marketing with it yet, because we feel like they're going to ask us and we're not going to be ready. So I think majority of those would be the general visitor. We can't know though, that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
We can't, so we would like to work out how we would know, really.
Yeah.
And yeah, we couldn't count them as such for any, Ministry of Education report. I don't know how we would count that.
I mean, which is why I guess in terms of keeping some of the materials back, so people actually have to get in contact with us, because that's in some way the only way we can then gauge, who's using it and how they're using it, and get also feedback from them. But I think the beauty in terms of, having that education focus is that it works really well for a general audience as well. I mean, I feel like all the material that we put out there was kind of based on sort of this class experience, but I mean, I love seeing the photos, of further research material, or I think the focus questions, to give you access to the show and give you an in to understanding sort of the themes of the exhibition. So that was,
I think that beyond education, it's actually just looking at the show from a real consumer point of view, which can be a bit different to a curatorial point of view. So, especially in art galleries, where those experiences the curator will hold back for aesthetic reasons, maybe, or their own conceptual reasons for not sharing the information that they have, or their research information, because they want the audience to behave in one certain way or another. But usually with education, you cut right through that, and as a visitor, a certain visitor will definitely want to know everything. Some, of course, don't. They just want to experience it as it is. No need to click on anything there, and just have a look around. But yeah, so it's a bit of flexibility, I suppose, for a viewer.
There's another question from early on from Left Bank. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the person. A more general question for virtual tour use. I find them pretty exciting as a resource to bring art and culture into rural areas. Are there any issues with intellectual property for, say, using them in after-school programs or in a public space? I'm thinking about a large screen in a theatre where people can visit in a kind of rolling visit setup.
I don't know, Nick, do you want to answer that question? I mean, from my perspective, of course, I mean, we've made it to be used either on a desktop or on a screen in the school. So I don't see any problem in terms of sharing that, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we did, when we got our permissions and paid our money, we were advised to follow up, not just say education audience, but say education and public. We didn't probably, I can't recall what the actual details on public was, but it definitely, they were approved. We kind of paid the education price, the people who supplied us. It was the historic images, basically, photography. Yeah, so it was public and education, but I don't know beyond that, I'm sorry. But we could follow up on that one with our staff, our communication staff who know about that sort of thing.
I think that's also, I don't know the answer in terms of, because I think it'll be different for each project, but I think it's a really good thing to think about up front in that concept stage as well, because that's such a cool idea. And I can picture these things reaching such a wide audience because they are so immersive, and they're also really flexible in how you can present them. So that was another thing that we talked talked a lot about at the early stage, was not just the audience, but how they're going to view it, because you have people coming to the website on their phone. But do we develop the tour for that platform, or do we develop it for a desktop? And I think we decided by narrowing it down and suggesting that the experience is better on a desktop, then we could focus on that. But you could project it up on a big screen. You could have it on an iPad or a tablet. So I think that's really cool, but it just seems like something that if you think about that from the beginning concept stage, then you kind of have that baked into it, and that just widens the reach of it. So that's a really cool idea.
I've got a question. So if you're going to do it again, which it sounds like you are planning to do another one, which is very exciting, what if anything would you do differently?
I don't think we'd be as much of a pain to Nick by keep on like giving him new versions of everything all the time, because we really were newbies. So it took us a while to get the lingo right and to really understand what he needed, and he was extremely patient. So while Nick may not do many things differently, we certainly would be much more efficient in how we approached it. Wouldn't we, Lisa?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, of course, with doing something the first time, there's always a lot of learning that happens. I mean, we were guided by Nick so beautifully. So in some way, yeah, setting that focus from the beginning was kind of, really valuable, wasn't it? But in terms of course, it also depends, do you work, in this case, we had an external curator. So anytime we changed anything in the writing, we'd have to go back to an external person, which, prolongs the process, etc. So it really also depends on each project. I mean, the project that we're working on now will entail a lot more artworks and a lot more mediums. So we have to get our head around that. If we have film and sculpture and drawing and archival material, and I mean, it's a whole other ball game. So I'm glad that that's not our first one.
I have another question. Do you know, I mean, I've seen a couple of those tours you mentioned, Nick, about going visit overseas galleries, and you just have a quick look round and you see the empty gallery space, and that's that. But do you know of any other examples of a kind of education-rich virtual reality tour along the lines of what you've made, with extra resource and extra information?
I'd probably say we looked, it might have been released around the time we were just starting to discuss it, but we looked at a tour that the Auckland Art Gallery, they've done two tours now. I don't know if it's education focused, but there's different kind of tours through the tour. There's a curator audio tour, there's a family tour, They're really good examples of kind of embedding the tour with a lot of with rich content. But the interesting thing, and this is, I think, one of the challenges we had, was that a lot of the examples out there are in real estate and commercial uses. That's kind of where a lot of this started, was real estate. And funnily enough, I think they have the same challenge. I think real estate have used these virtual tours and find that if there's no meaning embedded in it, it's just looking around a house that you've never been to. You get lost. You don't know what you're even looking at. But if they add information like how many outlets are in the room or the dimensions, it actually becomes more meaningful. So same principles apply.
Lisa, you've raised your hand. What would you like to say?
I have a question for Nick, because I'm not so familiar with all the different tools that you've mentioned before. And I was just wondering, let's say, I mean, if you have, you know, captured the exhibition itself with the photography, but is there one that, for example, also allows you, let's say, if you wanted to include a wall label or some audio, is there a way of kind of adding those layers in, or is it then mostly kind of just the visual art that those capture?
No, we can do that. With the software that we use to build this is actually probably one of the more customizable, and that's why I think the cost isn't so much in the actual software; it's just in the time. And at Puke Ariki, our technician Rosie and I've been working on that, and I think she's kind of been my sounding board as I figure things out in the development side of things. But you can do pretty much anything you can dream up, because it's essentially building a website. There's a lot of tools out there for virtual tours or for similar digital interactive experiences where I think it simplifies. You don't have to know, say, the coding. You don't need to know JavaScript. And that's what this does to an extent. But then you can lift up the hood and get really complex and do things with media. And so yeah, we can do that with the tools we have. It's just it's all a matter of time and expertise. The days are too short. That's the problem.
Well, I just think it's amazing. You've blown my mind, and I'm so pleased that you guys have made this. I really personally loved the exhibition, and I was quite sad at City Gallery that not many people got to see it because of the lockdown and the restrictions, and we didn't actually get to teach in it. And same as you, I developed a education program, bought all the materials, and then didn't get to deliver it because of the restrictions. Okay, we've got one last quick comment from Nathan. The artworks in this exhibition are open to interpretation by the viewer. Like most artworks, I know the first video showing the oil rig pumps away, etc., was just so powerful, particularly in the energy province such as Taranaki. It touched on so many topics. Do you want to speak, Nathan? Am I really misrepresenting your comment? Go ahead.
Oh, there you go. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying, when you were talking about intellectual property, because of artworks and things, a lot of artworks you can interpret your own way. And so different people, depending on your background and experiences, you'll interpret things in different ways. And I was just using that one as an example. You can take away whatever you want from that artwork or those art pieces. So, yeah, I was just wanting to raise that point. Yeah.
That's a really good point. And I think as well, for me, when I was in the exhibition, the sound was just so evocative.
Oh, yeah.
And I think when I listened to Anna Marie White talking about it, that she'd used a certain level of vibration in the soundtrack that was designed to kind of make you feel a bit uneasy and a bit unsettled. And it really did work like that for me. So yeah, I think there's all different things that you can take from an experience. Yes, Nick?
I just wanted to say, you mentioned the vibration of the sound. We found that it was actually so powerful, especially on the lower end, the bass end, that our first attempt at photography, the images were all blurry. It was actually, and I didn't notice because it was vibrating the sensor in the camera at such a low resonance. I didn't notice until checking them later, but it was pretty incredible. And it was really just intense to be spending that time photographing it from all those spots. But yeah, that was an unforeseen challenge that we've talked about doing something different. We learn from that. We'll keep the bass lower when photographing future.
Oh, funny, that's hilarious. Well, I think that has been a really great discussion. We're coming to the end of our time. It's actually just turned 4:30. So thank you, Kerry, for putting the resources up about Auckland Art Gallery there. I think we're all going to go and check that out now. Thank you to our three speakers today. That's been a really rich, interesting conversation. And thank you to everyone who put questions to the speakers. So I just want to quickly tell you about next week's webinar. Some of the speakers for next week's webinar have been on the call today. So we're going to be inviting Lee and Natalie from the National Maritime Museum and Debbie, Pare and Marlene from the National Army Museum to share some of their experiences in adapting programs for online learning. So it's going to be a really fantastic discussion and a great little insight into different ways of approaching online learning and the sorts of things you can do, probably on a lot lower budget than what you've just been talking about, Nick, but in a really effective, engaging way. So I hope you'll join us for that, and we'll just close up with our karakia. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki te uru tapu nui, kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara takatā. Koia rā e rongo, whakairia ake ki runga, kia tina, tina, hui e, tai ki e. Thank you, everybody. Nice to see you. See you next week, hopefully. Ka kite.